Hi there, I'm Daric Gill. I'm a painter, sculptor, and I make robotic installations. Today, I'm going to show you how I took scraps and reclaimed materials like these and mixed them with really cool sound samples from places like these. To create an interactive sound sculpture currently at the Center of Science and Industry Museum. This is a thunderstorm near Mount Eiger, Switzerland. This video will show the entire process from start to finish, including a lot of woodworking, code writing, sound editing, and a little bit about my travels. So I'll put a timestamp list in the descriptions below. You can see the base structures made from hollowed out logs. There's 3 of them, and I'm going to start from this point and work my way to the rest of the design. As you can imagine, since these are from real logs, each one of these tubes are a completely different size. Each one will get a thorough sanding inside and out so the whole surface is nice and smooth. I'm drawing out parallel lines because the edges aren't exactly square to the sides, and I'll need to true those up before I go any further. Here I'm cutting the ends that I just drew off with a jigsaw. Of course, there are tons of different ways to do this, and I even tested out a few of them, but I thought this was definitely the safest option, short of putting it on a giant bandsaw and rotating it backwards as the blade cut through it. Just seemed a little overkill. Of course, there is a big drawback to using the jigsaw, and that is the blade does flex quite a bit as you're cutting, especially through this heavy maple and cherry. So it required like a card scraper and, in this case, a razor blade to straighten off the edges to a 90-degree angle. Once I got the bottom flat, I went ahead and did the same thing for the top. I've had these tubes for a while, and after a flood that happened a few years ago, one of them actually split down the side. This was natural because it got waterlogged, so I needed to fix it. I took polyurethane glue, this is Gorilla Glue, and put it along the inside of the crack. Took some belt clamps, strapped them around the tube. Once it was nice and tight and the crack was sealed, I went ahead and screwed metal plates to the inside. As I rotate this and sand it, you can actually see there's 3 metal plates that are screwed in from the inside. This should be plenty stable for the rest of its life. You'll see that I spent a long time sanding the surface of these off. This is not only because of the texture and I wanted it to be smoother than this rougher surface texture that's on it, but also, as I mentioned before, it was in a flood, and this being an organic material, I wanted to make sure that there was a fresh surface that didn't have any traces of mildew or water damage or dry rot on it. Now that the tubes are sanded and flattened on the edges, I'm going to go ahead and work on these extensions. They look like branches coming off of a stylized tree trunk. All of the wood that this is made out of, and in fact most of the materials that I used to build this, are reclaimed. Much of it is warped and cupped and twisted really badly, so it needs planed and run through the jointer. Most of the work on this project was right here. What you're seeing is gluing up and flattening out and creating much larger pieces of wood out of smaller bits of wood. These are all cut-offs, and I don't want them to go to waste. So you'll actually see me do this quite a bit, where I cut off bad sections of the wood and then flatten them out and then glue them back together in a different arrangement. That's so I can build out much larger pieces of wood to then use later. Here I'm laying out a template for the different size branches that I'm using. This was done ahead of time because I actually have channels that run through the inside of the branches. This is for the wires that you'll see later in this video. Of course, all of this glue is a pretty messy process, so I spend time right now scraping it off so that it's clean and ready for the next phase. It may not make a lot of sense at the moment, but essentially what I'm doing is I'm building the inside of the branches where the channel fits and working my way outward as I go, making it a little beefier as I add layer by layer. Because this is the first branch that I'm making, the order of operation is kind of being figured out, and I'll just replicate this a bunch more times later. So this is actually a pretty big step here. I've got to a point where I've gotten it thick and there's a channel, and I want to make sure that the template fits correctly on it. It still needs to be a lot thicker to match the drawings and sketches that I've done, so I'm going to add more layers to it here. Like I said, because this is the first branch, the order of operation is being figured out on the fly. Now that it's the thickness that I want, I'm going to go ahead and trace down the template and cut it out on the bandsaw. I'm running it on the belt sander here so I can flatten the edges and see how well I did. This is the first of 4 different branches that I'm making, so I'm going to actually have to prepare a lot more wood. It's actually kind of funny. I have a library of wood that I've amassed over the many years of working in the woodshop and building artwork. Most of it is cutoffs and a lot of it's very warped and twisted. And for this particular sculpture, I wanted to use wood that I just haven't been able to use for other projects, mostly because they are just really twisted and warped. And it takes a ton of work, as you can see, to plane the edges, join everything, get it nice and flat and clean, and glue everything back up so that you have something thick enough to build more structure out of. Imagine having a Lego block set that you want to build something out of, but every single piece is a different length, a different height, and a different width. It's just very difficult to build something without it having wonky edges unless you create flat sides and thicknesses that are kind of uniform. So that's what this whole process really is taking different size materials, finding a way to find a common denominator in size, and then gluing them all up together so I can build something larger and more interesting out of them. Now that I've got some wood processed, I'm going to go ahead and start the next branch. You can see that I'm starting with the channel like I did before and working my way from the inside outward, creating a beefier structure as I go. This time, thankfully, everything goes a little bit faster just because I know what the order of operations are. Honestly, the hardest part in this section is waiting for the glue to dry. Gets me every time. Total side note, I think I went through an entire bottle of glue just by making these branches. If you're wondering why I'm running this on the belt sander right now, it's because I'm about to cut it on the bandsaw and I need at least one flat edge so it doesn't teeter-totter as I cut. So this is one of the most delicate sections of this entire sculpture. What I'm doing is taking a cutoff that I just created when I cut down the branch into this weird shape and using it as a jig to get a very specific angle when I cut this curve. Since the bandsaw creates a fairly rough edge, I'm actually going to take sandpaper and clamp it to the tube, which creates a positive shape so that I can reciprocate that into the branch. So there's this nice fit here, nice and tight and even. You'll get to see me do this a couple more times, and it's pretty exhausting work to be honest. Here I'm transferring the whole patterns and drilling a portal so that I can feed wires from the inside of the tube out to the branch. Of course, this is a pretty rough hole, so it needs to be cleaned up with a file and a little bit of chiseling. I don't want the branch to be crooked on the side of this. I want it to line up parallel to the trunk itself, so I went ahead and taped off lines and made sure that I had the right angle before I attached it permanently. Here I'm gluing on a lip to another one of those cutoffs as a jig so that I can make a third branch. And you get a different view of how I'm creating this curved angle using that cutoff as a jig. This time I actually left the jig attached to the branch so that I had a nice handle as I'm pushing it across the sandpaper on the tube. At this point, I knew it was going to take me a while, so I went ahead and put my headphones on and got to business. As I mentioned before, there actually are some blemishes in this wood since it's discarded and reclaimed. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking epoxy and mixing it with some sawdust from the sander and filling in those holes so that they don't grab or collect dust, and sanding them off and making them pretty much invisible. Since I'm pretty much done with the fabrication on the first trunk, I'm going to go ahead and start the second. Here I'm doing the same thing I did before, drilling out pilot holes and a section for the wires to come from the inside to the outside of the trunk. This industrial double stick tape, it's amazing. I wish I would have known about it sooner. Since the branches are kind of a weird shape, it's very hard to pin them down, so I'm taking a belt clamp and strapping it from the inside to the outside. This is to apply pressure and then, of course, keep the branch in the stable place while I'm figuring out where the pilot holes go. As you see, I'm about to start working on the third and fourth branches. They are going to look slightly different. I'm using cherry and walnut for these. They're going to fit on the center electronics console that holds all of the robotics for the system. And I'm just kind of delineating that with the design choices here. I actually got pretty lucky here. I was working through my library of materials and I noticed that I was kind of running out of longer stock. And I have a friend who had this cutoff of cherry that was quite nice, and this walnut was from my stash. Both of them worked out really well to make a two-tone look that I really enjoy for the next set of branches. By now you can probably guess what's the next step. Because I'm doing two more branches, I'm building the insides first out of the walnut, and then I'll move to the outside, which will be the cherry. This would be a really good time for me to talk about the piece. This sculpture is called the Memory Machine Sound. It's part of a series of interactive and electronic installations that abstractly mimic the emotional nuances of living organisms through light, motion, or sound. These robotic installations reflect the harder to quantify expressions of life, like excitement, extroversion, shyness, persistence, nostalgia, the ability to dream, that kind of stuff. In this piece, I was trying to figure out how I could chronicleize memories in a way that isn't so simple. We all have seen pictures of the Sistine Chapel, but what does it sound like? How do you store memories? Is it through smells or sights, or in this case, sounds? I wanted to make a sculpture that took really cool experiences, not just locations, but the experiences had at those locations, and create some sort of interactive display using those. I wanted an excuse to go out and do something interesting with my life and bring it back to share with you all. And maybe that's just enough inspiration for you to seek out those interesting flavors of life also. This particular piece started way back in 2019 when I was invited to a group exhibition that included artists and their relationship with the planet. I had made this really awesome robot during the pandemic that was at the Columbus Museum of Art. It was motion sensing, it had LED lights, and it played sounds. It was one of my finest pieces I've ever made, but it was very synthetic and made primarily out of plastic. In this piece, I wanted to make it out of organic materials. This was a huge issue. How do you make an electronic piece with limited amount of technology? So I decided I was going to use reclaimed materials and dig through the scraps of what I had to come up with something that didn't look like trash. It didn't look like recycled materials, but it looked like something interesting and museum grade. Aside from that, the original budget that was allotted for this project had completely changed. I actually had 3 or 4 different designs prior to this that included sense of smell, a sense of sight, and all kinds of radio broadcast frequencies. I even read, I think, 172 pages of the FCC regulations so that I could get my amateur radio license. But things changed and I'm happy with that. Okay, back to the process. In a second, I'm going to route out a recess so that that white plate can fit into the end of the branch. Because I needed to create several different depths, one for the white faceplate and another for the banana plugs, I ended up making several different templates using scrap materials. The router would run along the edges where that blue plastic is and create a rectangle that's small and then another rectangle that's a little bit bigger. That way I could run the router several different times and not take out too much material all at once. This is a pretty delicate operation because I'm going into the end grain and this router is pretty powerful. So you will see me double check this a few times to make sure I'm not blowing out the ends and I'm also going to the right depths. I am doing all 4 branches at the same time, so you'll see that there will be 2 of them that are solid cherry and a two-tone one here that has the walnut and the cherry on the outside. You'll notice I'm not using a template anymore. This is because I have a ball bearing on the end of the router bit that traces the inside of the hole, creating its own template using what's already there. Now for a little bit more patchwork. Here I'm using a roundover bit to knock off the sharp edges of the branches, just to give it a little softer look. Up until this point, I've kind of just dry fitted everything together. Something this custom usually takes a few fittings to get everything right. So now it's time to strap the 2 different branches on this center column and screw everything together. Next, I'm going to be working on the end caps. This is where the speakers actually sit. Because the tubes aren't exactly round, I actually have to do a lot of math to figure out where the center is. Now that I have the basic geometry figured out, I'm going to use the drill press to create a couple of pilot holes. This way I can drill safely into the end of the tubes without splitting the wood. You may notice a little overhang on that cap. I'm about to take care of that. Do you see that big fat router bit at the top? It's called a flush trim bit. I'm using it to run along the edge of the tube and cut off the excess from the lid that's on the top. A router bearing runs along the side and creates the exact same shape out of the corresponding piece. Here I'm cutting out the holes for the first speaker. It's intentionally rough because I'm sanding the rest up to the line using this oscillating spindle sander. I found a few pieces of scrap plywood at the wood shop that I work in, and I was able to use these for the end caps for each one of the tubes. Of course, I'm cutting it in the rough shape before using the flush trim bit on the router to get it exactly the same shape as the tubes. This is a dual compression bit by Whiteside, and it was pretty pricey to purchase, but I'll tell you what, it works so well. Now it's time for the second speaker hole. Of course, this is done exactly like the first time, rough cut and sand to the line on the oscillating spindle sander. I wanted to knock off the edges, again just like before, so I'm using the same roundover bit that I was using on the branches to make the edges less sharp. I make my large scale stuff from a makerspace and sometimes it gets pretty busy. As it happens, the router table was in use, so I brought my own router and finished the rest this way. The center trunk holds all of the electronics, and it has an end cap in the back just like the others, but the front's going to be very different. The end caps are going to get painted, so first I'm going to add some primer so that the paint can stick to the wood. I painted the top and bottoms of both the left and right speaker with this very colorful pattern. It's supposed to look a little bit like stylized tree rings. I felt like it was pretty important to add some color to really pop these speakers out because it's going to be hanging from maybe 14, 15 feet up in the air. And of course, you do all this work, you want to make sure that people really look up to it and get something out of seeing it. This is a color palette that's quite a bit different than what I normally use, and I ended up really liking the highly chromatic colors mixed with more neutral tones and the natural color of the wood in the final piece. You'll notice that I painted 4 of these because I did the front and the back of the left and right speakers. Now I'm adding some accent colors to the tops and the bottoms of the tubes. This ended up being really important because as I was working with the wood, it was really easy to flip these back and forth. And because they're not exactly round, it started to get actually pretty confusing which was the top and which was the bottom. So not only did this allow for some colorful accents, it also helped me with the registration when I was trying to find the right cap for the right tube. You might actually recall this color from the painter's tape that I have been using to mark off different lines and such. I actually really like that chromatic color, so I decided to keep it. An interesting fact is I've actually been using this same brush to do cut-in work on artwork for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years now. The nice part of this step is I can actually bring the tubes into the studio and work on them from the bench. And since I actually like to work in the middle of the night, it was kind of nice just to be able to put these on the bench, put on a pair of headphones, listen to some tunes, and work on it until I got tired. This paint is actually pretty translucent when it goes directly on the wood, so it requires me to make multiple passes over each color. Once everything's dry, I took a razor blade and scraped along the line to make sure everything's straight. This is arguably my favorite part of painting directly on wood. I'm giving the third and final trunk a slightly different color palette. You'll notice the wood is actually quite a bit lighter. This is maple instead of the cherry that the other 2 tubes were made out of, and the colors that I'm using reflect a little bit lighter shade wood. Now it's time to give everything a protective coating. I'm using Deft Clear Satin Lacquer here. I love this stuff and I've been using it for a really long time. There is a brush-on version of this lacquer, but I find that the spray lacquer works just fine. These are the two-tone branches, and you'll actually see in a second when I spray clear coat on them that the color pops and changes quite a bit. Everything gets a last sanding before it goes to the spray booth. I'm using a laser cutter and some designs that I made to make the end plates for the branches. Here I'm installing the terminal binding posts on the end plates. These will fit into the end of the branches in that void I routed out earlier. Next, I'm wiring up some connectors to the speaker wire and just putting it through the branches before I attach them to the tubes. You'll see me use these washers quite a bit. They have a rubber gasket on them so that I can apply pressure with the screw without cracking the plastic. At this point, you'll start to see me work a little bit more from the studio and less in the workshop, and that's because the electronics and a lot of the other kind of wire-based things are much easier to do from a controlled setting like this. Once I get to the actual electronics components, it'll almost be entirely from the studio bench. I'm using this belt clamp trick again just to screw down the branches, and especially on this one since it has two. You might notice that there's two different color of screws here, and that's because the branches are different thicknesses as it's at an angle and I need the appropriate screw to go into the right section. I'm dry fitting the speaker on, and I'll do this a few times just to make sure that everything fits and is nice and snug without being too taut. One thing I decided early on was that I was going to test it out as a fully enclosed speaker box first, and once I did that I realized that it definitely needed ports on the back side so that the air could escape and maximize the sound quality. So I cut a lot of blocks down using this crosscut sled. All of those lines you saw me draw were to find the center of each spacer. This allows me to figure out where they belonged on the geometry of the end cap, but also where the screw holes should be drilled. These will act as spacers to allow the compressed air to escape the tube, allowing for a punchier and thicker sound. You can see here that I once thought of drilling a bunch of bigger holes as a way for the sound to escape. Now that the blocks are firmly attached to the end cap, it's time to re-drill those pilot holes, just to make sure I don't break off a screw. Now it's time to permanently fix the speakers onto the end caps. I'm using these 6.5-inch marine grade speakers that I actually pulled off another one of my sound sculptures that happened to be on display at the Columbus Museum of Art last year. You should really check that one out too. I'll put the link in the description and you can check out the card above. I've been really impressed with these speakers. They have a good quality sound for the cost, they're not too expensive, and they have an RMS of about 50 watts at a peak of 150. They are typically used for boating, but hey, they work just fine for what I need them for. To keep the look similar, I'm using those same rubber bonded washers on the front of all of the end caps. This is the first you get to see how the spacers fit to the back end of the tubes, and I actually figured this distance out by listening to it as I pulled the back plate off. Now that I have the fit figured out, I'm using this foam speaker sealing tape to make sure that nothing rattles. Next, I need to make the control panel end cap ring, which acts both as a frame and a door to access the electronics. Circle cutting jigs on the router can be pretty expensive, so I decided I was going to design my own and make it out of scraps. The idea was to make something that could fit on the footprint of my current router, but could also be altered so that if I wanted a different radius, I could just do that really easily. I actually made a different ring that I didn't like the design very well, so I'm actually using the flush trim bit to make another blank. I put double stick tape on the back side of this blank and slid it over a nail. The template also slides on the nail, acting like a compass as it cuts in multiple passes. You'll notice that I'm slowly cutting a hole out. This is so that a window of acrylic plastic can fit in so you can see all the electronics. I'm cutting it in half here because I want this to act both as a window and as an access door to the electronics. And of course it gets sealed and primed as well. Because this is being hung so high in the air above people's heads in a museum, I need to make brackets that are substantial enough to hold such weight and out at a distance. I was able to salvage this what I think is barnwood. It's a mixture of swamp ash, hard maple, and oak. This particular stack of wood is actually called old growth, which refers to wood that was from trees belonging to forests that took hundreds of years to grow. All the rings are super close together, causing this to be a very dense group of wood. I'll admit, I actually broke off quite a few drill bits using this, but that sturdiness is exactly what I need to hold this up. Here I'm sanding off splinters and some burn marks from the table saw blade that was really having a hard time cutting this very dense wood. As you know by now, there are 3 different tubes, each with 3 brackets, 2 small ones and the middle one is a larger bracket. In a bit of overkill, I decided that it was a good idea just to make sure and order some 45-degree angle metal brackets to fit inside these. And each tube is hung by 3 different suspension wires coming from these brackets. Now it's time to write the codes and start building the electronics. This whole thing runs on about 6.5 pages of Arduino codes, and this is a small little snippet so you can see what it looks like. What you need to know is that a motion sensor triggers a microcontroller or a little brain. This brain runs a loop of codes over and over and over. And when that brain sees that the motion sensor has been triggered, it actually selects a track that's pre-recorded from an SD card. That then gets sent to an amplifier and then out to the speakers. I'll explain a little bit more of this later. In my code, I have all of the available tracks listed in a text file. This little brain is copying all of those into an array, or a searchable list if you will. And when the time is right, when the motion sensor goes off, it pulls a track from that list and starts to play it. And for good measure, this is what the whole code looks like. It's in 2 different tabs. I'm sure there's a better way of doing it, but this worked out for me. It's time to cut out plastic for the window so you can see all the electronics. The electronics are actually mounted on the inside of this window. This includes the amplifier and the microcontroller. I designed the control panel using Fusion 360, and I'm using a laser cutter to cut out all the shapes out of acrylic plastic. This includes the support structure that holds all of the electronics together. Again, all of this acrylic plastic is reclaimed just like the wood. This is mirrored acrylic from that previous sculpture that I mentioned earlier. So if you've been waiting patiently, this is where I start building the electronics. This is a DC buck voltage converter. This essentially allows me to take the power supply's 24 volts that's going to the amplifier and drop it down to 5 volts, which is more manageable for the microcontroller. The main microcontroller I'm using is an Adafruit Feather M4 Express with a Music Maker Feather Wing attached to it. There are less expensive microcontrollers out there, but I really do like Adafruit as a company and they have awesome tutorials for their products. That black box is a 160 watt by 2 Class D amplifier. Here I'm soldering together a plug connector for the DC power supply. This is a quick connect so that I can disconnect it and reconnect it as I'm putting things together. Now I'm finally laser cutting the clear cap that holds all the electronics and is the window so you can see everything. This is also reclaimed acrylic plastic pulled from a previous sculpture. It was an 18-foot long airplane wing that connected to NASA and lit up anytime the International Space Station flew overhead. I'll link that in the description below and a card up top. This window has hinges so that I can open it up as it's hanging and service it if need be. Here I'm soldering together connections for the motion sensor and a reset switch. Located on the other end of the electronics tube is a main switch that powers on everything. Here I'm soldering on spade connectors and crimping them onto wires that will connect the main switch to the power supply. The last step is connecting this power supply to the fuse switch and to the main control panel. Then it's almost ready for installation. Except one thing, it needs interesting sounds. Now it's time for the really fun part. Using a Zoom H1N, I was able to travel the world and get sounds like these. Of course, all those sounds need to be edited. A huge shout out goes to Carrie Bayer at WOSU's Emmy Award-winning show Broad and High. They did a feature of my work while I was making it, and she gave me some pointers with the software. I'll leave a link to that episode below and the card above. Besides balancing the sound and fixing everything in post, I was able to remove cracks and pops and buzzes and low rumbles. Each location has an audio description that plays before the track. This helps give a little bit of context to what you're about to hear. I also use text-to-speech on this.
In a few seconds, you will hear families casually drink their coffee in an outdoor garden behind Café Oswald's, a coffee house and art space. The tiny gravel grit on the ground crunches as people walk to their small, bright green tables. You can hear Germans talking. A siren from a European ambulance bellows, and a plane flies overhead. Dresden, Germany.
I really want to thank the installation team. In fact, this one guy did most of it. It's not an easy job, and there's a lot of complications that arise kind of on the fly. This museum, COSI, did a really good job, and I'm super grateful. This is the final result.